Hi, welcome back to my channel. After taking a bit of a break, I was thinking about kind of what software development looked like and how people are doing work in 2025. And I kind of thought about how Agile displaced object-oriented design in terms of UML and the rational unified process. And I thought I was going to do a little bit of talk about how we can maybe take a look at this and how we should maybe move past Agile and take a look at Agile from the critical standpoint that it did looking at that older object-oriented design and analysis, and maybe reconsider some of what those older methodologies did have that was useful even now. And the reason is I'm kind of looking at this is that in my mind, agile methodologies become less effective than the older methodologies is replaced. And given that, there's a lot of context that was left out that is still worth revisiting and revising and changing in terms of the newer languages and frameworks that we're dealing with. Now, here's the thing. I mean, the notion of that Agile is dying is a constant refrain has been. I found an article called The End of Agile in Forbes magazine, of all places. It was labeled in 2019. Of course, it's far from dead, which is why it's worth addressing now. If it was dead, we would already be talking about its replacement and making strides towards doing it. So again, as a history, what I see Agile was, it really was developed in response to this notion of what was being done in the unified modeling language, UML, and the rational unified process. And a lot of their criticisms were very fair. And if you take a look at the Agile manifesto, there's a lot of very interesting ideas about there about what was more important, this whole process or the actual things that were being made. And I have to give full disclosure, I did a lot of work on UML. I was very much on the UML side. So not only that, but I was working on UML when Agile was being developed, and was the work I had been doing with a lot of people was being targeted by these people. So I have my own biases here. So just be aware of that as I'm moving forward. So the thing about it is that what's interesting to me is that Agile has now become basically Scrum. And so what Agile criticizes is kind of consolidation in the rational unified process and the UML and what they call like this kind of consolidation of object-oriented analysis and design into one monolith is exactly what Agile has now become, which is basically for all practical purposes, when people talk about Agile, they're doing what Scrum does, and they're pretty much inseparable in most organizations. Now, some people argue this, but I would say from a practical standpoint, this is really the case. That Agile, because it's now becoming this just is now Scrum, is just as inflexible as monolithic as UML and RRP, the rational unified process ever was. The thing about that, though, is the UML and our rational unified process provided a lot of ideas and concepts to the table. Scrum didn't. And it provides even less real guidance on, well, here's the artifacts you need to make. Here's the kind of things you can do. There's much less thought put into like Scrum versus like, well, this is how I kind of do Agile. And so it really provides even less real guidance than the UML and RP ever did. So why I've been monolithic is slow, at least there's a lot of things you could chew on and develop and analyze there. When you take a look, it's like, why is my Scrum organization working? They really don't have anything to do but except blame it on you. Oh, well, you're not doing it correctly. You're not really understanding it, or you need to talk to your coach better. There's no accountability on their point. We're saying, oh, well, this is where these things might not work, or here's even more information on this type of stuff. It really falls very, very short unless it comes down to, oh, well, you need to buy more consulting or more coaching. All of this would be theoretical if it didn't come to the fact that basically developer burnout is a growing issue. It's becoming, I think it's also, especially now, with the current environment really coming to a head. And how all this affects how developer retention, how it leads to burnout. In a lot of cases, the just general mental health issues and problems developers are facing, and specifically facing because of their career, very compared to other people in the workforce. And a lot of this kind of can be linked back to some core values of Agile gone completely awry. And what I mean by this is that when you look at it, the first book that was kind of labeled as kind of the sediment for Agile programming was called Extreme Programming. And it came out with a lot of very interesting ideas. And Kent Beck was a very good developer, a very talented developer, working with other very talented developers. And he just kind of put some ideas out there. It's like, what if we did things like this? The problem is that he also kind of laid the groundwork for why not everybody should work this way. And it was in the title itself, Extreme Programming. It was basically for people that are very, very talented, this is how something they could organize projects as a team. What it ended up happening though is that there's this notion that, oh, well, basically everybody should be able to do it at this level. And it's completely unreasonable. And the agile methods and the manifestos really didn't really take a look at it and say, you know what, I really relied on this concept of very talented developers, the 1%. Not only that, or maybe the 10% of the 1%, the truly, really super talented programmers, and expected that everybody could do that. And you don't necessarily look at the very smallest part of a bell curve to figure out what the rest of the bell curve can do to become better. And that's where Agile really did go off the rails, is that what it did without a lot of guidance, just expected to be everybody to be 10x programmer, make more code. So looking at all this, what can we do to move past it? Now, I was going over this and I was like, you know what? Given my biases, it'd be really nice to I'm going to talk about UML. I'm going to talk about how all that and the rest of the unified process and all this stuff could come back, and that would be really great. But it'd be really self-serving at best, and I don't think it'd be very helpful because it doesn't really target the development landscape that we're currently in. And what I mean by that is people have a lot of interest in functional programming languages, are kind of disdaining object-oriented programming, even though I have, as I've said in other videos, that's probably misguided in most cases. So the natural question about, okay, how can we do that in terms of UML and modeling? There's not a good answer for that for functional programming yet. So I think that's an academic exercise. And because of that, I'm going to just move past that. So what is worth exploring from this as opposed to agile method for development? And there is one thing that I borrowed from this whole process thing that I think really needs to be highlighted again, and that's use cases. Again, Ivar Jacobson, kind of the person that invented the concept. I put a link there to his latest book on that. It's a good read. It's fairly short. It's 74 pages. And there's shorter ones as well. The thing about it is that our requirements now, in terms of what we get, in terms of user stories, are just pale shadows of use cases. And so many of our stories are just linked to non-functional requirements in terms of, oh, we need to scale things. We need to be architecture. We need to use this technology, do this, update this, do this library, not do this library, change this, versus, oh, this is what the user does, right? And if they're almost to the point where person logs in, okay, great. Yeah, the stories around the obvious types of things. But when it gets to a little bit more complicated uses, it just completely falls apart. And so developers kind of are led to intuit what users want to do, or, and they're pretty bad at it. So really, if one thing, we really need to bring back requirement gathering and management as a specialized skill, and that needs to be recognized as valuable to any software project. It's something that I actually really enjoyed doing and wish I got to do more of, because I liked writing, obviously, as an academic. I didn't have a problem with writing. And I liked the challenge of bringing the kind of abstract things from a non-technical world and helping explain those to developers. Also being able to understand coding. The thing about that is for various reasons, I had to move around between jobs. But after I got my PhD, requirements gathering was already starting to be kind of basically becoming less popular as Agile came along. It's just kind of said, oh, you just write stories. So a lot of the specialized, knowledge around that was already kind of being dismissed and dismantled. And not only that, but I was a person that basically, again, because it was Agile, I wasn't that kind of manager who's like, well, he's more a manager type and knows how to talk to people. It's like I also was a pretty good coder, and since I was a good coder, well, we want you to be a coder because the ultimate thing is code. And so, again, these really useful documents of process got completely devalued because it wasn't code, right? Again, with architectural design decisions, you do need to plan these things out. They just don't fall out of the code base or a trend of what's really cool in the current development environment. And projects need design advocates too. They need people coming along that advocate for, using better technologies and language features and so on and so forth. And it seems counterintuitive, right? Well, wait a minute. Shouldn't Agile always be about that? You always want to do that and move fast? The problem is that in the reality is that the rapid cycle of sprints and the demand to, maintain team velocity makes it so that you will make incredibly narrow and conservative choices in what you do in projects. It takes forever for people to get off and use new frameworks or use new ideas because at best you'll be successful, but in the short term, you will look less successful and you will get penalized that for many organizations because you're not spitting out as much code because you're learning how to do it better. The other case where this happened was testing and operations. The notion of a software engineer and test, of having specialized test people and specialized operations people, that needs to come back. Um, Shifting all this into DevOps and onto developers, it was really just about false cost savings. It wasn't about code quality, even though there's a lot of cool things that came out of code, infrastructure as code, and making better tools for that kind of stuff. So people were just like not clicking buttons or having to log into servers to do stuff. That's all fine and good. But the thing about it is that while developers need some insight into that operational pipeline, it's not going to be happen as a side project just so that they can get something out to the users. And certainly it is not reasonable to, oh, hey, by the way, since you're doing all these sprints and stuff like that, but you need, we're all about continuous integration and being together as a team, that you will be on call when something goes wrong. If you ever want to make a team actually more conservative about what they do and put out there, make it so that they have to be on call when something inevitably goes wrong. And 10% of the time, it's not even because of something what they did, and they have to just sit there and watch while somebody else figures it out. Yeah, do that instead of actually hire specialized people that know, oh, by the way, you will be working these hours and we accept that, and you will be doing this stuff, and you only call these people if you need to do some type of things. That's just one of those things where I think that's, like I said, that's completely beyond the pale. And it's one of those things that's more and more common these days, is that there's more and more expectations of a developer's time outside the given work hours even. And I find that a little bit ironic that these same type of people that seem to push that, it will be one of those people that also insist that you come in the office to work. And if you are in that situation, that'd be one of those things where please consider malicious compliance in that regard, where if they are demanding that you come into the office to work, if you are not that office, you do not work. So software development is neither a sprint or a marathon. So 2 week sprints are completely unreasonable. This is the most blatantly obvious thing about Agile that everybody can look at and say, duh. But no one ever says, well, maybe we should change that. It just does not make sense. No one has the ability to work that fast to make that enough, provide enough data in 2 weeks that you can act on it and move how you do things as a team. Almost nobody can do that. Not only that, but basically this idea that sprints is that means you're going far out and you're doing all this stuff. And increasingly, it means that you get less and less time away from projects to do things like learn new technologies, work with your family and friends, enjoy hobbies, actually live, right? But again, going back to extreme programming, the most fascinating thing about this in the history of Agile is that Kent Beck, at the very beginning, made it very clear. You do this for 40 hours a week. You do not do it for 41. You do it for 40. That's it. And he said, and it was very clear in the extreme programming book that it is something where there's a clear delineation from work and everything else. And you get 8 hours of work and you get not 1 hour more. And now that has been completely forgotten, or is worse, just a cruel joke along with unlimited PTO. Now, the thing about it is Kent was not right. Kent should have said 32 hours. And if you look at the economic research and where we are, and a lot of people that are doing this and started to adopt this in the EU, this is absolutely correct. 32 hours is about really what you can get in terms of just productivity and actual work out of somebody. The best example of this that, of course, has got erased in the terms of better bottom lines was someone who did basically what he called the 30-40 project, where we go on to manufacturers and he would present them a lot of data and on how basically what they can do with their workforce is that they're doing manufacturing and they could make them be just as productive. And all they needed to do was make their workers work 30 hours a week, but pay them exactly the same as if they were working 40 in terms of benefits and everything else. Ignore the fact that they're part-time, anything like that. Just same thing, just 30 hours and 40. And what you can do is, because you're in manufacturing, working with expensive machines, you can idle those machines and save a lot on electricity and other costs in terms of wear and maintenance. And he worked to be absolutely correct. For the people that did it, there's still some organizations and places that still do that. Unfortunately, as manufacturing left the U.S., it became less popular. But the thing about it is that they did, because what it is those workers were already pacing themselves to do the amount of work that they were doing. Now, all they had to do was just change that pace and just put it into 30, knowing that they would go home, have more time to rest, more time with their families and stuff like that. And so they didn't have to pace themselves in the same way. and we're happier overall. And meanwhile, the equipment isn't running for 8 hours a day. And for some of those corporations, that's a huge amount of overhead that they're saving. And of course, we wouldn't get that in development because there's not that kind of stuff. But in terms of actually making workers happier, more productive, it's pretty clear you got 30 hours a week. So what this comes down to is that what I really came down when I thought about this, and I wanted to avoid this as much as I can and stay on the technical side of things. And what I thought about it is that the real thing about it is that what's going to make Agile change is not going to be some new technique or methodology or idea, as much as I would like it. As much as my researcher brain says, oh, I want to make it so this is a new, latest thing in how you do functional design or functional domain derivative design or whatever, or reactive patterns or whatever that's been out there, really is going to be just kind of a side dish to the main issue. And what the main issue is that we're not going to get real changes in how we do things in terms of the stresses we're put on until we organize as a labor group. Until software developers organize and do some form of collective bargaining, none of this is going to change. And because it's not a technical thing, this is ultimately about getting more out of workers for less investment. And organizations were always going to do that because they are solely responsible shareholders. Again, that's an economic idea someone made up, but that seems that if that's the prevailing trend, to go against that, you have to organize as a labor organization. Now, does that mean you have to start a traditional union? No, there could be other ways of doing this that might work better. And it's one of those things where I find fascinating that people seem that the software developers, people that really embrace change and new ideas, seem to find it completely impossible that could also be done for how we organize labor in this country. And that we would end up just being another corrupt union, as it were. Very odd to me. So beyond that, what would be some quick fixes? First of all, we could go back to major releases once a year and just kind of celebrating that as once a year and basically having that cycle and make that much longer. The users they don't need constant UI changes or new features. The thing about it is that you still want to have these operational pipelines so you can put out bug fixes as fast as possible. That's the great thing, is that you don't need to redesign your website every 6 months or a year or add new features every 3 months or it's dead. You really don't need to do that. Users don't care. If you're providing the functionality that they want it to be consistent. An excellent recent example of this was if you look at basically there was a major redesign to Trello, which got acquired by Atlassian, that was so uniformly hated that the buzz about it was huge. I heard about it, and I don't even work in programming anymore, and I saw it on the news feeds. So basically, it's one of those things is that if that can go wrong, it's one of those things where it's like you just put more plan into what your major releases is, talk more to your users about what they need, and not only that, but not panic if your product isn't significantly changing every major version or every year or two. Second one, obvious, just do 2-month sprints. If nothing else, if you have to do all the same stuff and all the same jokes and all kinds of same things, just do 2-month sprints, put a few more stories in there, and you'll be better off because you're not having to try to come up with what we should do better with approximately 2 weeks of data about what you've done. Let your workers self-organize and do stuff like that. Not only that, but you're going to have to build in some resiliency in terms of people going in and out, having time off and things like that. 2-month sprints, better for everybody. Finally, just stop thinking about code as the only artifact that matters. Just reward solid, workable documentation and mentoring, other things like that. Reward quick failures. Reward people that went out there, put themselves on a limb, and then found out it breaks, and that's why you shouldn't go out there again. It's just as important as going down the right road. And this is the biggest one I find, is that let people code as a career. It does not have to be this calling. It does not have to be an obsession. You do not have to be able to go from work and want to work on your own coding projects to be an effective part of a team, right? That's just ridiculous. Okay. And it leads to a really bad culture of a lot of people huffing and puffing about how good they are at something when they are not actually that good at it, and just making other people feel bad. And it's one of those things where it's great for the people that hire these people because they don't point to a dysfunctional organization that's devaluing them as a whole. They let these people eat each other up over this stuff and exploit that churn because they're constantly being, when you have people that are constantly fearing that they're not good enough and are going to be replaced, they're exploitable. You can pay them less, right? It's harder to replace teams that work together as a unit. It's harder to replace team members that work together with other people as a unit. That's harder to do, period. So it's much better off that you have people going off and saying, haha, skill issue, than going off and saying, yeah, we are not getting the stories that we need from people. You are not letting us do to users. And really speaking out behalf of the developers to the rest of the organization. No, let them fight amongst each other about who's the best coder. It's ultimately a dead end. Unfortunately, what I see happening is that what's going to happen is AI is going to be the next big kind of thing in software, not in software methodology. And what I mean by that is that it's the next big, huge tool that everybody's going to have to use to make development and do things development better. And the problem is going to be is it's going to have all the complications of UML, Rational Unified Process, and Agile, but maybe 5 or 10 times worse. And the reason being is that it's just going to require so much infrastructure, be so ethereal in how it's used. And not only that, but it's going to enable so much pressure on developers to do even more work and spend more time with no real gain in compensation because they can be replaced by someone who uses AI better. Even though no one might eventually be able to use it well at all, that might be a big gamble that doesn't pay off. If that fear is there, it's going to be able to just drive another cycle of making people work harder and harder for less real compensation. What this ultimately going to come down to is that will break. There'll be more and more people that leave the profession and do other things. And as the efforts to kind of disorganize organizational labor and collective bargaining will continue, that burnout, that cycle will happen. And we'll have this, basically we'll have a bigger bus cycle in which there's just going to be less software. There's going to be less software that people are going to be developing. And what industries that software is not going to be used in as much, I can't say. My guess is there'll probably be a lot of social media will be the first thing to fall off the radar, as the value there is pretty tentative. And you're already seeing increasingly amounts of feedback in terms of how useful it really is to us as a society as a whole. I think that'd be a really easy target. So you're going to see less dating apps. You're going to see less social media startups. You can just see a lot less of maybe mobile apps in general, and more of a focus on maybe business productivity and some of the things like that. But I can't say. I will know that there is probably going to lead to yet another constriction, and then more likely than not, a huge rapid demand for, we need new developers to clean up all this crap we made from using these tools, just as happened with fourth generation languages in the 80s. And in some cases, to be perfectly honest, some of the things that happened with overusing object-oriented stuff in the 90s and 2000s. So there it is. Anyway, I know that's a fairly cynical presentation and it kind of ends on a sour note, but at the same time, there's a lot of potential there and upside for making software development a much more viable career. And it really doesn't take much to organize on a local level, starting within the company and moving on past that. And not only that, but with that will also come the technical innovations. And so hopefully I think people will start, as developers, instead of start constantly boasting about how good they are about it, start sharing more about what they're not good about, sharing about the fact that they are also having problems with this and keeping up. And that would be great. And it's one of those things where I personally had to accept this, as I was someone with a disability who no longer can work full time or part time. It's very hard for me to kind of keep up in a world where people are constantly boasting about how well they can do versus, well, you know what? Sometimes I have a bad day at work just like everybody else. And, there's value in doing things besides coding. And so anyway, thanks for watching. If you got this far, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.